Number 6. At different points in history, transportation was seen not only as a means of travel, but also as an object of dangerous entertainment. When railways first appeared, trains became symbols of speed, power, and progress. But for some young people and workers, they quickly turned into toys, something to experiment with. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the deliberate sabotage of tracks and rail cars spread across many countries. People placed stones, metal objects, or tools on the rails just to see what would happen. Others climbed onto rail cars, clung to moving trains, or rode on the roofs. For them, it was a test of bravery and a way to show off in front of friends. Few truly understood the risk. Overhead wires carried high voltage, and braking systems were not designed to handle foreign objects. Trains derailed, cars overturned, and people were killed instantly. Often, the victims were not those who started the game, but engineers and passengers. There were also cases of intentional damage to transport for amusement or protest. Young workers loosened bolts, damaged connections, or threw heavy objects from bridges. Even minor interference could cause a catastrophe at speeds the human body could not survive. The tragedies repeated again and again, yet the trend did not disappear immediately. Danger was seen as part of the thrill. Only after a series of fatal accidents did authorities begin introducing strict punishments and railway security. For many, however, the lesson came too late, at the cost of several lives. Sabotaging transport stopped being a game only when it became clear that the inevitable loss was human life. Even then, danger ceased to feel like a game only when the consequences became irreversible. Transportation remained new, exciting, and poorly understood, and this created fertile ground for even more senseless and deadly entertainment. In the early railway era, newspapers regularly reported incidents that today seem unbelievable. Young people deliberately threw stones at trains, testing the strength of the windows. In other cases, boys placed objects on the tracks to watch the wheels crush them. These experiments often ended with fragments flying back into the crowd, fatally injuring the very spectators who were watching. In the United Kingdom and the United States in the late 19th century, police recorded dozens of deaths each year linked to what would later be called train surfing, long before the term existed. People climbed onto train roofs or hung from the outside, unaware that overhead power lines could kill instantly. Many died not from falling, but from electrocution, without even time to scream. There were even more absurd cases. In some industrial cities, workers deliberately rocked rail cars or removed small fastening elements, treating it as a joke or a way to break the monotony of a shift. Railway company archives contain reports where the cause of a disaster is listed as unauthorized interference without motive. Most tragically, the victims were often not the initiators. Engineers, passengers, and bystanders paid with their lives for someone else's curiosity. Only after widely publicized disasters did the press begin openly calling such actions deadly stupidity rather than harmless mischief. This is how society gradually learned a simple truth. When technology advances faster than understanding of its dangers, people begin to play with things that allow no room for error. Number 5. For centuries, appearance defined social status. Pale skin was not merely a fashion trend, but a symbol of power, wealth, and a pure life free from physical labor. This is why people deliberately applied substances to their faces that slowly poisoned them. One of the most dangerous cosmetic products in early modern Europe was the so-called Venetian ceruse. The desire to appear as light-skinned as possible existed long before 16th century Europe. In ancient Egypt, the aristocracy used lead-based powders to distinguish themselves from peasants who worked under the sun. In Greece and Rome, fair skin was considered a sign of noble origin, so both women and men widely used whitening mixtures, unaware of their toxicity. During the Renaissance, this ideal only grew stronger. Venetian ceruse was made from a special lead compound mixed with vinegar and water. The paste dried quickly, creating a perfectly smooth, almost marble-like mask. Skin imperfections, smallpox scars, and even signs of aging disappeared. But beneath this perfect surface, the body slowly began to deteriorate. Interestingly, these mixtures were originally considered medicinal. They were used to dry wounds and ulcers. Only later did people begin applying them to their faces daily, sometimes leaving the makeup on for several days at a time. Lead gradually accumulated in the bloodstream, damaging internal organs. Among the most famous users of ceruse was Queen Elizabeth I of England. She used the cosmetic for years to hide the effects of smallpox and to meet the beauty standards of the royal court. Toward the end of her life, her health declined sharply, and historians suggest that chronic lead poisoning may have played a decisive role. One of the most tragic stories was that of Countess Maria Coventry. Her skin literally deteriorated from constant use of ceruse. Instead of stopping, she applied new layers of makeup over open wounds. At just 27 years old, her body could no longer endure it. Lead poisoning caused more than physical symptoms. People lost their memory, became irritable and aggressive, suffered from depression, and gradually lost the ability to think clearly. For centuries, society worshipped beauty without realizing that it was slowly destroying those who chased it. Number 4. Throughout history, fashion has repeatedly led people to willingly abandon their own safety. For the sake of aesthetics, protective elements were removed, weakened, or deliberately ignored, even when they saved lives. What looked beautiful or prestigious often left people defenseless against chance and accident. In the 19th century, with the rise of industrialization, factories were filled with machines that had exposed mechanisms. Workers were advised to wear tight, protective clothing, but fashion dictated otherwise. Long coats, scarves, neckties, and loose sleeves were seen as signs of neatness and proper appearance. These items easily became caught in shafts and gears. Factory archives from that era are filled with records of people being pulled into machines along with their clothing, often resulting in death within seconds. Urban life was no less dangerous. Shoes with thin, smooth soles were considered elegant, while sturdy, slip-resistant footwear was seen as rural and unfashionable. In winter, people frequently slipped on stone streets, broke bones, suffered head injuries, and died from complications. Protection from cold and falls was sacrificed in favor of looking proper. Even in transportation, style often outweighed common sense. In the early 20th century, passengers on trains and trams would remove barriers, hold on to decorative elements, or lean outside vehicles because it looked more respectable or felt more convenient. Falls under wheels and impacts with structural parts were common causes of death. The fashion for displaying masculinity was especially revealing. Protective helmets, belts, and handrails were seen as signs of fear. People rejected them to appear brave and strong. As a result, even minor accidents became fatal. The history of this fashion is simple and brutal. When appearance becomes more important than survival, clothing stops being protection. It turns into a trap. And time and again, aesthetics cost people their lives. This fashion of removing protection was especially evident where danger was obvious but deliberately ignored. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cities saw rapid growth in bicycles, trams, and automobiles. Yet any form of protective gear was considered ridiculous or shameful. Helmets were associated with workers and children, not respectable adults. As a result, even minor collisions often led to fatal head injuries. Another example was the fashion for long garments among women. Voluminous dresses, long skirts, and trailing hems looked luxurious but posed serious danger. Fabric easily became caught under carriage wheels, tram cars, or elevator mechanisms. There were documented cases where people were literally dragged along the street by their clothing, with no chance of survival. Even in the home, style often triumphed over caution. Candles, gas lamps, and open flames were common interior features, while clothing made from highly flammable materials was fashionable. Dresses and robes catching fire became so widespread that doctors of the time described burns as a common domestic cause of death. All of this shares one defining trait. Protection existed, but it was considered unnecessary. People understood the risks, yet social standards forced them to choose appearance over safety. In this way, fashion ceased to be a matter of taste and became a matter of life and death. Number 3. Throughout history, people have been willing to mutilate their own bodies in order to conform to ideals of beauty. In many cultures, appearance was considered more important than health, and physical pain was seen as an acceptable price for social approval. One of the most brutal practices was the deliberate deformation of toes and feet. The most well-known example comes from ancient China, where the tradition of foot binding existed for nearly 1,000 years. Girls' toes were broken in early childhood and their feet tightly bound, forcing them to grow into an unnatural shape. A small foot was seen as a symbol of femininity, obedience, and high social status. The cost, however, was horrific. Wounds frequently became infected, tissues died, and gangrene set in. Many women lost the ability to walk normally, and some died from blood infections. Similar practices existed in other regions as well. In Europe, narrow shoes with rigid pointed toes led to chronic toe deformities, open wounds, and constant pain. Infections that are easily treated today were often fatal in the past. What began as discomfort could end in amputation or a slow death. The absence of effective medicine made the situation even more dangerous. People did not understand the causes of inflammation and considered pain normal. Open wounds were hidden, wrapped in dirty cloths, or simply endured. Social pressure forced people to continue these practices even when the body could no longer cope. Mutilation in the name of beauty was not accidental. It was systemic. Society rewarded those who suffered in silence and condemned those who refused. In this way, ideals of beauty became a tool of control, breaking bones, destroying lives, and often ending in death. These standards were neither rare nor isolated. At certain times, they became almost mandatory. Historians estimate that in some regions of China, up to 90% of women from wealthy families had bound feet. The process began in childhood, when bones were easy to break. Toes were bent under the foot and tightly bound, forcing it to heal into an unnatural form. Pain was not a side effect. It was part of the process. Infections were common. Inflammation, rot, and tissue death were seen as normal stages. In some cases, people waited for parts of the toes to fall off on their own, as this reduced the size of the foot even further. What would be considered a medical catastrophe today was once viewed as a successful outcome. A similar logic existed outside China. In Europe, extremely narrow shoes with rigid tips were worn for centuries, deforming toes and causing open wounds. Without antibiotics, even minor infections could spread throughout the body and end in death. Yet rejecting fashion meant social exclusion. The most paradoxical aspect was that physical disability was often considered attractive. Slow movement, pain, and dependence on others were interpreted as signs of refinement and high status. Society did not merely accept this suffering, it encouraged it. This is how beauty standards became a system that broke bodies and ruined lives. People knew it was painful and dangerous, but the fear of social rejection proved stronger than the fear of death. Number 2. Social trends have always existed. People have always searched for entertainment, even when it was pointless, even when it was dangerous. Long before the internet and viral challenges, people already wanted attention. They wanted to impress others. One of the strangest and most dangerous trends was sitting on pillars. This practice appeared as early as the 5th century. A group of Christian ascetics, known as stylites, climbed tall columns and lived there for years. The word stylite comes from the Greek stylos, meaning pillar. They believed suffering purified the soul, isolation, hunger, heat, cold, rain. The most famous was Simeon the Stylite. According to historical sources, he spent up to 42 years on top of a pillar in Syria. He ate almost nothing and endured extreme conditions, believing he was rejecting earthly life to save his soul. Centuries later, the idea returned. But without religion. In the 1920s and 1930s in the United States, pillar sitting became public entertainment. It began with a stuntman named Alvin "Shipwreck" Kelly. In 1924, he climbed a pole near a department store in Philadelphia. He sat there for hours. Crowds gathered. The stunt worked as advertising. Kelly turned it into a career. He traveled from city to city, sitting on tall structures for weeks. He advertised stores, sports events, and movie theaters. People even bought tickets just to watch someone sit high above the ground. His personal record was 49 days on a pole in Atlantic City. Soon, others followed, from amateurs to professional pole sitters. But behind the spectacle was deadly danger: exhaustion, dehydration, sleep deprivation, extreme weather. One small mistake was enough. One loss of balance. And the fall was fatal. The trend faded during the Great Depression, when people lost interest in such shows. But the danger never truly disappeared. In 1974, a 72-year-old professional pole sitter named Richard Blandy died in Illinois. During a promotional event, a car crashed into the structure. He fell from a great height. It was a brutal reminder. The higher people climb in search of attention, the deadlier the fall can be. Number 1. The most frightening part of all these stories was not the foolishness of individual actions, but how quickly they became widespread. People rarely acted alone. They copied one another because it was accepted, fashionable, or approved by those around them. What began as a single experiment or a strange idea very quickly turned into a trend. In the past, there were no social networks, but there was something even stronger: community pressure. If someone had already done it and survived, others assumed the risk was exaggerated. Each new participant believed that luck would be on their side. This is how dangerous practices spread without any control. Collective behavior dulled fear. When people saw dozens or hundreds doing the same thing, the danger felt less real. Responsibility seemed to dissolve into the crowd. No one felt personally guilty, even when the consequences became fatal. It was mass repetition that turned foolish ideas into deadly trends. It was not technology, objects, or circumstances that killed people. It was the desire to be part of the majority. History repeatedly shows that collective stupidity is more dangerous than any single risk because it pushes people to the edge without ever questioning why. That is why such trends were so difficult to stop. Historians and sociologists studying mass behavior in past centuries have repeatedly noted one pattern. The more people participated in a dangerous practice, the less dangerous it seemed to each individual. This phenomenon was described as early as the 19th century, long before modern psychology existed. Newspaper archives from that era often contain similar phrases: an accident during a popular pastime, a tragedy caused by carelessness. But between the lines, something else was clear. People did not do these things because they were unaware of the risk. They did them because they saw others doing the same. Popularity created an illusion of safety. Interestingly, in many cases, the first fatal incidents did not stop a trend, but attracted even more attention. Newspapers began reporting on the dangerous practices, crowds gathered, and new volunteers appeared eager to try it themselves. In some cities, authorities were forced to ban entire phenomena only after the number of deaths became public and impossible to ignore. Researchers of crowd behavior note that people in groups tend to shift responsibility away from themselves. When everyone is doing the same thing, it feels as if there is no longer a personal choice. This is how foolish ideas stopped being isolated mistakes and became systemic problems. History shows that the most dangerous trends almost never arose through coercion. They spread voluntarily. People chose risk because they were afraid to stand out, to be cautious, or to appear weak. This is the core paradox. Most deadly trends existed not because there was no choice, but because of the desire to belong to the majority. That is how collective foolishness became stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. And that is why history repeats itself again and again, only changing the scenery.